Hey guys, tonight we travel back to a time when the most powerful empire in the Islamic world wasn't busy waging war or negotiating tense treaties, but was instead growing flowers. Specifically, tulips. Yes, tonight we drift into the silk pillow-scented lull of the Ottoman tulip era, when the sultans wore embroidered robes, hosted poetry slams, and outcompete each other not in swordplay, but in the cultivation of the most breathtakingly impractical tulip imaginable. You probably won't survive this episode, unless you have a particularly high tolerance for opulence, lamplit fountains, and historical horticulture. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing how far this sleepy little corner of history stretches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin your stroll along a winding path paved with white marble. It's late evening in Constantinople, soon to be known as Istanbul, but not yet, and the air smells faintly of rosewater and grilled lamb drifting from some distant courtyard. The palace gardens sprawl before you, lit by delicately painted lanterns. You pass a eunuch holding a tray of chilled fruit, and he bows so slightly you almost miss it. You're not just anybody here. You're moving through history, wrapped in its strange perfume. This is the early 1700s, and the Ottoman Empire, yes, the one with scimitars and minarets and a reputation for occasional beheadings, is doing something unexpected. It's chilling. After centuries of warfare, conquest, and territorial wrestling matches with Persia, Austria, and Russia, the empire enters what might generously be called a vibe era. They've got enough land, more or less, and enough enemies respecting their borders, mostly. So, the rulers start focusing on the fine things: art, music, fashion, and, for some bizarre reason, tulips. The Ottoman elite get it into their heads that tulips aren't just pretty, they're transcendent. A tulip isn't just a flower, it's a metaphysical symbol. Of what? Well, that depends on who you ask. Some say divine perfection. Others say wealth, mystery, or a particularly poetic form of boredom. What we do know is that during the reign of Sultan Ahmed III, the entire upper crust of Ottoman society begins funneling wealth and attention into tulip cultivation like it's the 18th century version of crypto. And speaking of Ahmed III, let's paint the scene. He's not your stereotypical sultan lording over maps and flinging generals into battle. No, Ahmed likes poetry. He hosts garden parties. He writes verses under the pen name Nesib. If he were alive today, he'd probably be posting filtered shots of his favorite dahlias with inspirational captions. He rules from 1703 to 1730, and for a good stretch of that time, he is completely taken with tulips. Not just growing them, but organizing them into exquisite displays, exchanging rare bulbs like baseball cards, and commissioning poets to compare their petals to the curve of a lover's eyebrow. Historians still argue whether Ahmed's tulip fixation was a shrewd form of soft diplomacy or just an emperor avoiding more pressing issues, like military reform and economic stagnation. But what's certain is that under his leadership, the Ottoman court starts looking a lot less like a war room and a lot more like a botanical salon. You walk past a reflecting pool shaped like an 8-pointed star, water whispering over its lip. Servants flit by in slippers so soft you barely hear them. Everything here is calculated to impress, quietly. The empire's power, in this era, isn't about clanking armor or raised voices. It's about beauty. Controlled, deliberate, luxurious beauty. And tulips become the emblem of that aesthetic. Now, it wasn't just any tulip. Oh no. These were not your average flower shop tulips with their polite little round heads and cheerful reds. Ottoman tulips were tall, thin, and almost absurdly pointy. Think of the difference between a Labrador and a greyhound. Or a decent selfie and a full-on photo shoot. They came in streaked colors, crimson veined with white, pale lavender edged with black, and the more flamboyant the better. You had to be rich just to pretend you understood tulips properly. And this is where it gets weird. Because once the sultan starts doing something, everyone who matters starts doing it too. Suddenly, viziers are showing off hybrid tulips bred in their private courtyards. Military officers are sneaking away from strategy meetings to check on their bulbs. Poets are finding deep metaphorical resonance in root systems. The Grand Mufti, the top religious authority, is rumored to have sent a coded letter in floral puns. By now, you've reached the heart of the imperial gardens, where the night air is thick with the scent of blooming citrus and watered soil. There's a low platform ahead, draped in silks, where Ahmed once sat to observe his favorite tulips by lamplight. Legend says he kept a little notebook where he gave his tulips nicknames. Some were named after stars. Some after verses of the Quran. And at least one was allegedly called Little Sword of My Solitude. That one never bloomed. Of course. You notice a carved stone at your feet. It reads something like, "To plant a tulip is to await beauty in silence." Poetic, right? Until you realize someone probably said that while ignoring a tax crisis. Oh, and here's your quirky tidbit for tonight: Ottoman tulip bulbs were sometimes stored in silk-lined drawers and perfumed before being replanted. Yes, really. Like royalty. You half expect to hear the bulbs whispering among themselves, complaining about the humidity. The whole thing might seem ridiculous, and it is, a little, but that's the charm of it. The tulip era wasn't a golden age of progress or industry. It was a strange, delicate moment of imperial pause. A collective sigh. A time when power manifested in petals and the sharpest social competition was over who had the tallest, most dramatically drooping tulip. You wander deeper into the gardens, past fountains that burble like half-forgotten lullabies and archways covered in climbing jasmine. The moon glints off gilded trellises as if even the stars want in on this floral fever dream. Somewhere, a flute player meanders through a melody that sounds suspiciously like a love song to a particularly graceful blossom. And here comes Sultan Ahmed III again, this time not just admiring tulips, but obsessing over them. The man didn't merely enjoy a good bloom. He curated them, as if each tulip bulb were a work of statecraft. You wouldn't be surprised to find him whispering to the soil or rearranging the petals by hand while muttering about the philosophical implications of curved stems. Ahmed had his faults, sure. Historians still debate whether he was a visionary romantic or just sort of distracted in a dangerously luxurious way. But one thing's for sure, he could throw a garden party like nobody's business. He didn't rule alone, of course. He leaned heavily on his Grand Vizier, Nevzahirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha, a name that's both too long and too influential. Ibrahim Pasha wasn't just a bureaucrat, he was basically the interior designer of the empire's soul. He orchestrated architectural revivals, sponsored public works, and, yes, fostered tulip culture like it was a national security priority. The two of them, Sultan and Vizier, became the Oprah and Gale of petal-based politics. They talked tulips at breakfast. They evaluated garden symmetry like military formations. The palace records from this period contain whole sections dedicated to bulb acquisitions, planting schedules, and bloom projections. You can just imagine a clerk somewhere in the bowels of Topkapi Palace, quill trembling in hand, tasked with writing, "His Imperial Majesty prefers the deep violet with pale pinstriping. Not the mauve. Never the mauve." But this obsession wasn't confined to the palace. Oh no. It seeped into the social bloodstream. Everyone who was anyone became a connoisseur of tulip aesthetics. A proper Ottoman aristocrat in 1715 didn't brag about war medals or lineage, they boasted about their cultivar. Ah yes, the Shah's breath, mine opened 3 days early. Tragic for poor Mehmet, his bloomed crooked. You continue along the path, shoes crunching softly over bits of white sand. On your left is a hedge trimmed into the shape of a lion, on your right, a pavilion with wooden panels so finely carved they look like lace. The air is thick with the scent of freshly turned soil, incense, and maybe just a hint of competitive tension. And yes, there was competition. The tulip era wasn't some tranquil utopia of harmonious gardening. It was more like the Great British Bake Off meets Versailles. People tried to out-tulip one another. Hosts sent out invitations to midnight flower unveilings. Dinner parties were timed to coincide with peak bloom. Poems were recited in front of particular tulips, and if you thought your bloom was especially rare, you might hire musicians to serenade it. One nobleman reportedly had a 6-piece ensemble play only during twilight when his favorite tulip was at its most photogenic. That tulip, by the way, was named Whispers of the Hidden Garden. Pretentious? A bit. Enchanting? Also yes. Historians still argue whether this flowering frenzy was sincere devotion or strategic status signaling. Maybe it was both. Maybe you couldn't afford to look disinterested in tulips if you hoped to stay in the Sultan's good graces. In a world where a crooked stem might reflect poorly on your judgment, imagine the stress of an unseasonably dry March. And let's not forget the poets. Oh, the poets. This was their golden age, too. With tulips blooming across every courtyard and rooftop terrace, they wrote couplets and quatrains faster than the petals could open. Tulips were metaphors for unattainable beauty, fleeting pleasure, divine symmetry, you name it. A well-placed tulip reference in your love poem could win you a patron or a kiss. Or possibly both, depending on the garden party. And here's your quirky tidbit for this section: Ahmed III was so obsessed with flowers that he reportedly commissioned a royal mirror just for observing tulips in reflection, because the soul of a flower is seen best when twice removed. What that means, nobody really knows. But it does sound like something you'd say after a little too much honeyed sherbet under a linden tree. One of the more entertaining, if slightly tragic, stories of this time is about a low-ranking courtier who tried to impress the Sultan with a new tulip strain he claimed to have grown himself. The poor man borrowed money, neglected his duties, and spent a small fortune on imported soil. The result? A bloom so underwhelming it was described as a carrot in mourning. No word on what happened to him, but we can safely assume his career wilted. Your feet take you across a narrow wooden bridge, its beams creaking softly under your weight. Lanterns swing from its railings, casting flickering gold patterns over the pond below. Koi swim in lazy spirals, unbothered by history. Somewhere beyond the hedges, a peacock gives its signature honk, a sound that, like much of this era, is both elegant and ridiculous. And this is the paradox of the tulip era, serene on the surface, but brimming with tension just below. Sultan Ahmed wanted peace. He wanted a legacy of culture, of refinement, of ethereal beauty. But empires aren't flower beds. They don't stay neatly pruned. Eventually, people start wondering why money is going to silk pillows for tulip pots instead of food or fortresses. Still, for now, all is quiet. The petals have not yet fallen. The empire is basking in a strange kind of floral mirage, one where beauty seems to be enough. One where a single bloom might earn you praise, or poetry, or perhaps an invitation to a midnight garden where even the stars blink in floral rhythms. You leave the imperial gardens behind, your footsteps now swallowed by the quiet cobblestones of a noble district where nothing smells like power, only wet soil, rose attar, and possibly an overwatered hyacinth. It's still evening, but the city doesn't sleep. Not really. It lounges. Here, the bureaucrats dwell, not hunched over dusty scrolls or plotting military campaigns, but in open-air pavilions obsessing over soil acidity and bulb angles. These are the empire's finest minds, viziers, treasurers, judges, and they've gone absolutely feral for flowers. You pass a mansion where a group of men in embroidered kaftans are clustered around what looks like a shallow sandbox. No, not a playground. It's a tulip bed, flanked by scrolls and diagrams. One man is arguing, passionately, about the right distance between bulbs. Another is waving a color wheel. They look like they're on the brink of a duel, but over shades of purple. Historians still argue whether this distraction from actual governance contributed to the later instability of the empire, or if it was simply a momentary indulgence during peacetime. One thing is clear, these weren't your average bureaucrats, they were full-time florists with a side hustle in running a world power. You step closer to listen. One of them is recounting the story of a disastrous planting in Üsküdar, where someone dared to arrange red and yellow tulips side by side. Scandalous. Apparently, the aesthetic clashed with the melancholic ethos of late spring. Someone gasps. You quietly back away. This strange horticultural fever gripped even the most level-headed officials. Imagine a finance minister who won't release grain subsidies until his tulips reach their full height. That's not a joke, it actually happened. A treasury official once postponed a review of provincial tax rolls because a rogue frost had emotionally compromised his flower bed. To be fair, tulips don't like frost. But neither do peasants when the bread stops arriving. You find yourself at the base of a slender tower with intricate lattice windows. It belongs to one of the imperial scribes, a man responsible for drafting laws and royal decrees. He also, incidentally, writes a personal tulip journal. Yes, an entire logbook devoted to daily petal progress, bulb moods, and philosophical insights prompted by morning dew. A sample entry, day 42, she opened with a sigh today. I am undone. Same, honestly. This wasn't just rich people being frivolous, it was full-on social theater. Owning a garden was no longer enough. You needed rare varietals, strategic petal curvature, and most importantly, neighbors who were deeply jealous. You imagine a very polite arms race, with flower boxes instead of muskets. What made it even weirder was the terminology. Each tulip strain had a name, and not a normal name. These were abstract, poetic, and slightly unhinged. The sigh of the moon. Whispers on burnt silk. Loneliness drenched in blue. That last one may or may not have been named after a failed marriage proposal, we're not sure. And here's your fringe tidbit for tonight, there's a possibly apocryphal tale of a tulip named the Vizier's Regret, which allegedly refused to bloom for 3 years, only to open spectacularly the day its owner was arrested for corruption. Coincidence? Poetic justice? A sentient flower enacting revenge? Who can say? But what made all this even sleepier was how absolutely meditative it became. These men, so used to controlling armies and treasuries, were suddenly stooping in silence, whispering to seedlings, waiting. The pace of tulips is slow. You can't rush a bloom. And maybe that's why it became such an obsession. In a world where most people were still living hard, short lives, the idea of a single perfect tulip, brief, quiet, unbothered by politics, felt like control. Like a kind of purity. The more ambitious tulip fanatics even formed what were essentially underground societies. Think book club, but with gardening gloves and coded invitations. One such circle was rumored to meet every new moon to unveil their latest creations. They drank rosewater and mint tea, recited floral haikus, and performed silent judging. The only rule? No clapping. Just appreciative sighs. And the rivalry between these amateur botanists? Lethal. Not literally, but you could ruin a man's career with a whisper about his failing bulbs. If your tulips were stunted, spotted, or, heaven forbid, blunt-tipped, it didn't just mean you had a bad season. It meant you lacked vision, taste, and maybe even moral character. Some took extreme measures. Special soil imported from Persia. Elixirs made from crushed almonds and pigeon droppings, yes, pigeon droppings, because of course. Tiny mesh umbrellas to protect the blooms from rogue gusts of wind. And there's at least one record of someone paying a painter just to sit near his tulips and sketch their energy to encourage blooming. Spoiler, it didn't work. But the sketch? Gorgeous. You duck into a courtyard, half hidden behind tall wooden doors. Here, away from the bigger mansions, a quieter form of tulip love unfolds. A middle-ranking official is tending his tiny patch with the focus of a monk. He doesn't host parties. He doesn't name his bulbs. He just tends. Quietly. Repeatedly. Tenderly. It feels holy. And you realize, beneath the wealth, beneath the weird names and cutthroat garden parties, there was a real, genuine awe. An almost spiritual reverence. The tulip, brief and blazing, became a mirror. In its curves, they saw themselves. In its silence, they found peace. For a brief, strangely fragrant slice of time, the most powerful men in the Ottoman Empire were all just gardeners, kneeling in the dirt, trying to coax beauty out of the ground. You follow a gentle slope down toward the quieter outskirts of the city, where the streets begin to unravel from stone into packed earth, and the houses grow more modest, but no less obsessed with florals. The tulip craze, it turns out, was never content to stay behind palace walls or silk-robed salons. Like the roots of the flower itself, it spread, downward, sideways, unexpectedly, right into the hands of merchants, barbers, bakers, even the occasional watermelon vendor. This is where the tulip goes populist. By now, it's the 1720s. Sultan Ahmed III and his garden gnome Vizier Ibrahim Pasha have been pollinating the empire with tulip fever for nearly 2 decades. And while the elite compete over increasingly absurd cultivars with names like Blush of a Widow's Lantern, the everyday folk have begun growing their own. Not just for status, though there's a little of that, but because it's become fun. Like a really slow, dirt-based video game. You pass a tiny tailor's shop, the windowsill of which is overflowing with pots. Not silk or cloth, just pots, jammed with little green stalks. The tailor's inside hemming a robe, but every now and then, he glances lovingly at the bloom closest to the sun. It's not fancy. Just orange. But he looks at it like it's family. Tulips at this point had turned into a form of emotional currency. A suitor might court someone not with a horse or poem, but a rare bulb. Kids began giving them to teachers. Housewives planted them in leftover olive tins. It was a tulip democracy, and everyone had a vote in the form of compost. Of course, markets responded the way markets always do when something beautiful gets popular, by jacking up the price. A single bulb of a rare breed could now cost as much as a small house, though this is where historical records get a bit spicy. Historians still argue whether the reported prices were real or simply exaggerated by grumpy officials tired of seeing civil servants spend their salaries on fancy dirt. Either way, the numbers were nuts. You pass a cafe, though calling it that is generous. It's more like an open-air nook with 3 stools and a tin pot of strong black coffee that could probably remove paint. Inside, a small group of men are sipping slowly and arguing loudly about flame tips versus double curls. One insists that the flame-tipped tulips have a more aggressive charisma, while another swears by the elegance of a good double. The third simply grunts and points to his drawing, a tulip so wildly elaborate it looks like it belongs on a Paris runway. They fall silent and nod in reverence. That's the one. Here's your quirky tidbit for the evening. During the height of the tulip craze, some households began giving names to their favorite bulbs, feeding them with honey water, and, yes, singing to them. There's even a record of a widow in Galata who swore her tulip only bloomed when she played the oud. That, or it was very sensitive to humidity. The science is fuzzy. With popularity came theft. Tulip bulbs, once humble little knobs of potential, now had to be locked up. Merchants built hidden compartments. Gardeners slept near their flower beds. One enterprising grocer even trained his dog to bark at anyone who leaned too close to the soil. It worked. The dog became a local celebrity and was eventually rewarded with its own tulip, named Faithful Snout. Historians don't mention if the dog appreciated it, but one hopes. You wander through a side alley where a young girl is carefully watering two small pots, each labeled in surprisingly neat script, Sun-Kissed Drifter and Red Secret. She looks up, sees you, and shrugs like she's in on the joke. "My brother says they'll make me rich," she says. "I just think they're pretty." Her voice is sleepy, and her plants glow in the lantern light like fireflies made of silk. And here's where the tension sneaks in, quiet as a root system beneath your feet. While the empire's streets bloomed, so did discontent. Bread was getting more expensive. Jobs were harder to find. Taxes began to creep upward like ivy on a crumbling wall. The common people didn't blame tulips, yet, but there was a growing whisper: if the empire could spend so much on petals, why couldn't it fix a leaky roof or refill a granary? Historians still debate whether the tulip craze caused unrest or merely mirrored a deeper rot. Like perfume sprayed on spoiled fruit. On the surface, everything smelled lovely. But if you pressed too hard, the sweetness turned. Still, back here in the city's quieter veins, tulip culture was less about opulence and more about belonging. You stop at a small bakery where the windows are fogged with heat and flour. A tulip painted on the glass seems to smile through the steam. Inside, a baker is brushing egg wash on a tray of rolls shaped like flower buds. He doesn't look rich. But he looks happy. For the working class, tulips weren't status symbols, they were tiny rebellions. A pot on a windowsill said, "I deserve beauty too." A painted flower on a bread crust said, "Art belongs to all of us." The empire may have been run from gilded courts and bejeweled beds, but here, among the bakers and tailors, florists and fishmongers, tulips became something softer. More human. You pause as you reach a small fountain. It burbles contentedly beneath an overhang of ivy. A cat sleeps nearby, belly up, absolutely at peace. Just beyond, someone has scrawled a message on a wall in charcoal: "When the empire falls, let it be in petals." You stare at it for a long while. Then the wind shifts, carrying the scent of baked sugar and flower beds, and you move on. You follow a lanternlit street that loops around a hill, where the silhouettes of wooden mansions perch like tulips themselves, thin-stemmed and delicately balanced. The night is growing quieter now, with the rustle of cypress trees and the faint splash of water echoing from some unseen courtyard. The empire sleeps, but not fully. Not while tulips still bloom. You duck through an archway and emerge in front of a rather unremarkable house. Except it's not unremarkable if you know what you're looking at. This was once the home of a certain Abdolsalih Levni, the court artist during Sultan Ahmed III's reign. Levni, who turned petals into paint, and paint into propaganda. If the tulip obsession had a visual architect, it was him. Inside the house, now a modest archive, you find replicas of his famous miniatures. You lean in. These aren't just flowers. They're coded language. Stylized tulips flank sultans on horseback. Blossoms replace the halos of saints. There's one image of a banquet, possibly based on a real one, where every dish on the table is shaped like a different tulip. It looks delicious and deeply impractical. And here's your historical fact for tonight: Levni helped create the Surname I Vabi, a massive illustrated festival book that depicted the lavish 1720 circumcision festival for Ahmed III's sons. Sounds niche, but it's important. Because in nearly every scene, amid musicians, fireworks, and parading elephants, tulips appear like quiet spectators. Not the main act, but everywhere. In embroidery. In food. In hairpins. They had become not just popular but woven into the DNA of imperial identity. What Levni and others did was turn flowers into soft power. Art became the delivery system. You see, it's one thing to say your empire is thriving. It's another thing entirely to look like you are. The Ottomans were no strangers to that game. But during the tulip era, they played it differently. Not with military parades or gold-plated cannonballs, but with delicate brush strokes and painted petals. You pass a large open courtyard where the scent of pigment clings to the air. It's a workshop, a place where manuscripts are still illuminated by hand. The apprentice here is dabbing gold leaf onto a tulip border, her brush steady despite the hour. Her master leans over and nods, satisfied. Then he returns to his own scroll, humming softly. You realize they've probably painted hundreds of these by now, yet each tulip remains a little different. A quiet rebellion against symmetry. Historians still argue whether this artistic saturation was a genuine reflection of cultural values or a carefully crafted distraction. Were tulips a mirror, or a mask? It's hard to say. Levni's art is beautiful, yes, but it's also deeply curated. Nothing accidental. Every bloom placed just so. Like an Instagram filter before cameras existed. And that brings you to a less glamorous corner of the story: the printers. The unsung heroes, or victims, depending who you ask, of the tulip propaganda machine. Around this time, the empire finally allowed the use of printing presses for non-religious texts. Big moment. But what did the first printed books feature? Tulips. Loads of them. Manuals for flower cultivation. Poetic odes. Even budget-friendly sketchbooks so less skilled citizens could draw their own cultivars. It was like flower-themed adult coloring books, 300 years early. You pass a bookseller's stall where the covers glisten with ink and varnish. One volume catches your eye, The Melancholy of Petal Edges. Dramatic, even for a tulip book. You flip through and find pages filled with near-mystical advice like, a blossom closed at dawn speaks of a secret too heavy to bear. You shut it gently. No need to traumatize yourself with floral cryptics before bed. One particularly strange, but very real, book from the time includes not just cultivation notes but also mood annotations. For example, this bulb thrives in loneliness, and best watered when reciting tales of lost love. That's not horticulture. That's a very poetic cry for help. You slip down a quiet lane behind the bookseller's cart and find a hidden mural painted on plaster. A massive tulip, its stem coiling around an hourglass. No text. Just the image. You pause, struck by how it seems both hopeful and exhausted. And now for tonight's fringe tidbit, there's at least one surviving tulip miniature that depicts a flower with a tiny human face nestled in its petals. No one knows why. Some say it's allegory, beauty hiding grief. Others think it was a subtle jab at the court, implying that everyone in power was just playing dress-up in floral costumes. Or maybe it was just Levny being weird after too much rose sherbet. Either way, the image stuck. You arrive at the outer edge of a garden owned by one of the court poets. The gates open, and the path is lined with shallow marble channels designed to reflect moonlight onto the petals. It's a setup that took someone days to calculate, just for the fleeting pleasure of midnight bloom gazing. You walk slowly, watching the flowers glow. At the center is a stone bench carved with a phrase, "May your silence outlast your scent." Poetic? Sure. Also a bit ominous. But that was the thing about this era. Beneath all the glitter, there was a strange, sleepy sadness. Everyone knew tulips don't last. That's kind of their whole deal. You plant. You wait. You watch. And then, in a flash, it's over. Maybe that's why the art was so obsessive. It was an attempt to freeze the unfrozen. To capture beauty right at the moment it slips away. You sit for a moment beside the garden's reflecting pool. There are no sounds now but water and wind. A petal floats down from nowhere. You don't catch it. You just watch. And when you finally rise, your footsteps echo not with fanfare, but with the hush of paintbrushes and pressed pages, of petals turned to pictures and pictures turned to memory. You leave the poet's garden behind, though a few lines seem to follow you like smoke. Let not your petals boast, for even silk must rot. A bit dramatic, but it sticks. The path now carries you into quieter terrain, fewer mansions, more winding streets shaded by sycamore and elder trees. You pass occasional night watchmen, lanterns bobbing like fireflies, but most of the city is still. Still enough that you begin to hear it, the faint, rhythmic clipping of shears. Gardens never sleep during the tulip era. You round a corner and find yourself in the outer quarters of a noble family's estate. Not the palace itself, but a side garden, cared for with the same manic attention. Here, a team of gardeners, hunched and whispering, are at work by moonlight. Not because they're secretive, though, honestly, they kind of are, but because tulips demand it. The air is cooler. The petals less stressed. And moonlight, they say, makes you gentler. Tulip cultivation had evolved into its own form of obsession, halfway between science and slow-motion gambling. Every gardener harbored the same dream, that one of their bulbs would bloom into something never seen before. A new streak, a never-before-documented petal twist. The botanical equivalent of inventing a color. You stand for a moment, watching one gardener gently turn a bloom between his fingers, like a jeweler inspecting a gem. His eyes flicker with hope and panic. Here's your mainstream historical fact. During this era, the Ottomans developed a near-spiritual reverence for Laylar, especially those with broken colors. These were tulips infected with a mosaic virus that caused streaks and flares, unpredictable, flamboyant, utterly mesmerizing. Of course, they didn't know it was a virus. They just called it divine touch. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman horticulturists deliberately passed along infected bulbs or simply lucked into the most chaotic flower mutations in history. Either way, they kept the streaked ones close, like little floral lotteries. The garden you're in has a whole section gated off, nothing but striped tulips. Each one tagged with a name. Not numbers, names. Bleeding Sky. Veil Snare. Tear of the Nightingale. It's a little dramatic, but hey, naming tulips was serious business. There were entire catalogs of names, some of which read like bad romance novels, others like sword techniques in a kung fu movie. Splintered Flame, Crimson Whisper, Shadow's Wound. You pass a gardener holding a small brush, which he dips into saffron water before gently stroking it across the soil. You ask him what he's doing. He doesn't answer, just looks up and whispers. It makes them braver. You're not sure if he's joking. He might not be. By now, the act of growing tulips has taken on the weight of ritual. Gardeners wore specific clothes, dug with specific tools. There were even beliefs, half superstitions, half science, that playing certain instruments in the garden would encourage blooming. The ney, a reed flute, was the flower favorite. Gentle, breathy, a little melancholic, just like the tulips themselves. And now for tonight's fringe fact. It's whispered that one ambitious courtier once spent a fortune training a team of songbirds to trill only during tulip blooming hours. The birds apparently sang in harmonized cycles while dancing among the beds. There's no record of whether the tulips were impressed, but one can assume they enjoyed the effort. Probably. Your feet take you past a compost station tucked behind a hedge. Even the compost is regal, layered with crushed rose petals and tea leaves, dried melon rinds, and, if rumors are true, the occasional dust from powdered emeralds. Okay, maybe not often, but it's said that one eccentric vizier once believed that gemstone powder improved stem rigidity. Spoiler, it didn't. Just made the worms suspiciously bougie. You crouch beside a low flower bed where a small, lone bulb has just pushed through the soil. It's not named yet. Just labeled with a wooden tag? There's something quietly powerful about that. A tulip without a story. Not yet glorious. Not yet tragic. Just a potential. The moonlight's bright now, painting shadows long and soft. You hear a distant rustle and catch a glimpse of the head gardener, robed and stern, scribbling in a thick leather-bound journal. The entries are less scientific notes and more mood diaries. April 3rd, blue trembles. Pink too proud. White still quiet. It reads like a floral therapy session. Historians still argue whether these journals served actual agricultural purpose or were just deeply committed performance art. Either way, they're one of the reasons modern scholars can reconstruct the full psychodrama of Ottoman tulip gardens. Every petal had a personality. Every bloom, a narrative arc. This wasn't farming. This was theater. And tulip theater came with its villains. Rogue gardeners who snuck into elite plots to steal bulbs. Rival nobles who spied on each other's compost blends. One story tells of a eunuch gardener who deliberately sabotaged a competing bloom by salting the soil, only to be exiled to a plum orchard as punishment. Harsh, but also poetic. From tulips to plums. From glory to jam. You stand now at the center of the garden's heart, a mirrored basin surrounded by the rarest of tulips. The reflections double their number, making it look like a portal to some velvety, pastel underworld. Each one is lit by a floating lantern, bobbing gently on wires. The scene is absurdly theatrical, but that was the point. Gardens like these were status, identity, political stage and romantic daydream all rolled into a patch of dirt. You sit again, because the world feels slower here. A petal falls. You don't catch this one either. You just watch it land on the water, spinning like a boat with no destination. You feel the hush, the peculiar hush of a garden in bloom, when everything's been trimmed, turned, watered, and loved. Not for harvest. Not for use. Just because. Just beauty for beauty's sake. And as the night deepens, you wonder what drove them, those gardeners, those nobles, those poets, to pour so much effort into something so fleeting. Maybe they believed the moment of bloom was enough. Or maybe they feared what waited if they stopped. Either way, you get it now. You brush your fingers across a tulip stem. It's soft. Cooler than you expected. Alive in that still, quiet way that things can be alive without needing to shout. You step quietly out of the garden, leaving behind the floating lanterns and whispering blooms, though they seem to follow you in spirit, clinging to your sleeves like pollen. The city is quieter still now. Even the fountains gurgle sleepily. The moon hangs above Istanbul like a pale, nosy eye. Your feet bring you to a wide plaza that once hosted one of the more curious events of the tulip era, the Lail Devri pageants. Not quite parades, not quite court rituals, these were a strange hybrid, part political theater, part horticultural beauty pageant. Think flower cosplay meets imperial flexing. Only with more embroidery and fewer sword fights. Although, there were some sword fights. People got passionate. Here's your mainstream historical fact. During Sultan Ahmed III's reign, large public spectacles were held where the best tulip cultivars were displayed, not unlike modern-day flower shows. Ambassadors were invited. Local elites paraded their most dramatic blossoms in lacquered boxes, held up by servants wearing matching petal-colored tunics. Some say even the Sultan participated anonymously, sneaking in his own bulbs to test whether merit still held sway. Historians still argue whether that last bit is just romantic fiction. But if true, imagine the Sultan peeking from behind a curtain, watching to see if his moon-wound flame got more claps than the Grand Vizier's blushing silence. You pass a column engraved with symbols. Not war heroes. Not divine blessings. Tulips. So many tulips. There's even one shaped a little like a skull, though that might just be erosion and your very sleepy imagination. This was the odd magic of the era. The tulip wasn't just a plant, it was the crown jewel of soft power. Nations showed strength through steel or ships. The Ottomans, for a few brief decades, tried petals. It's like competing in a boxing match by showing off your calligraphy. Bold. Very bold. A side street draws you in, tiled with stone mosaics. You notice a repeating pattern, tulips in a circle, 4 at a time. Notably, all 4 are slightly wilted. It's deliberate, not sloppy. A design choice. Some scholars suggest it symbolized the fleeting nature of power, while others think the artist just had a very emo week. There's something beautiful about deliberately drawing your flowers just past their prime. Like choosing to smile in a photo with tears still on your cheeks. Further along, you come across a dilapidated theater, the site of a forgotten performance once staged for foreign dignitaries. The script, now only partially recovered, was apparently a full-blown tulip opera. Imagine this, a soprano dressed as a tulip bulb, dramatically lamenting the absence of rain. A baritone dressed as a jealous rose, threatening to eclipse her glory. The curtain rose, petals fell from the ceiling, and someone, probably drunk on pomegranate wine, declared it the most transcendent thing they'd ever seen. Tonight's quirky tidbit: one court favorite was said to have constructed an entire costume out of dried tulip petals for a masquerade ball. The outfit reportedly crumbled halfway through, turning her dramatic entrance into a crunchy, whispery walk of shame. She recovered, though. By morning, her outfit had become a poem recited across the city. Not about vanity or failure, but impermanence. You pause now beneath a carved archway, where words are etched in Ottoman Turkish. The script is floral, almost too delicate to read. You lean closer. It says, "Beauty must never be still, for it is borrowed from wind." Again, poetic. Slightly cryptic. Maybe just what happens when philosophy is filtered through a flower. Across the square, a water seller snores beside his cart. His jugs bear the faded image of a tulip, worn down by hundreds of rinsings. It's a reminder, tulips didn't just float in the elite sphere. Their image trickled down to daily life. Soap stamps. Stenciled tiles. Even the sugar molds in cheap bakeries were tulip-shaped. When your empire is obsessed, no spoon escapes the branding. And yet, here's the tension. The more common tulip imagery became, the more the elites pushed for exotic rarity. This created a kind of botanical arms race. No longer satisfied with familiar blooms, nobles began importing and crossbreeding in search of the perfect form. Not just color or height, but attitude. They wanted tulips that stood like dancers mid-bow, petals that curved like calligraphy. There were even criteria for tulip posture. Yes, posture. A slouching tulip was unworthy. A tulip that stood too upright? Arrogant. It was a balancing act. Literally. One particularly infamous tulip, silent gold, was said to have been stolen from a merchant in Vienna and smuggled into the empire inside a hollowed-out Bible. Was it worth it? Possibly. The bloom earned its owner a promotion and 3 marriage proposals. The tulip didn't last, but the legend did. You sit now at the edge of a dry fountain once filled with floating petals during festival nights. It's quiet here, almost like the air remembers. If you close your eyes, you can nearly hear the laughter, the rustle of silk, the low hum of court musicians plucking strings while fireflies glinted off the petals. Historians still argue whether the festivals were genuine cultural expressions or state-sponsored distractions. Were the people celebrating beauty, or numbing themselves from political tension? At the time, the Ottoman Empire was facing growing unrest, creeping westernization, and economic strain. So was the tulip craze joy or denial? Hard to say. Maybe both. You rise from the fountain, stretch, and follow the cobbled path toward a shadowy promenade that overlooks the Bosphorus. Below, ships drift like slumbering beasts. Above, the stars have dimmed slightly, morning is not far off now. And yet, even here, a planter box sits at the edge of the railing. Inside it, a single tulip. Not exotic. Not flashy. Just red, and gently bowed by the breeze. Not everything needs to compete. The promenade gives way to a narrow stairway carved into the side of a hill, stone steps softened by centuries of slippered feet. As you descend, the scent changes, less flower, more earth. Damp limestone, a whiff of baked bread from somewhere, and something oddly metallic, like old coins. You're entering a part of the city most tulip tourists never saw, the bulb dealer's quarter. If the palace gardens were catwalks, this was the backstage chaos, where tulips began their strange little lives underground. And yes, this is where things start getting shady, figuratively and literally. Down here, the light barely filters in, and the merchants speak in hushed, coded phrases. Golden drop means a bulb that promises yellow blooms. Weeping child hints at a troubled lineage. But if someone whispers, the widow's sigh, you're being offered something illegal. A tulip cultivar so rare, so genetically unstable, it's rumored to bloom once, cry quietly, and die on the spot. Dramatic? Of course. But in the tulip era, drama sold. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In the early 18th century, tulip bulbs could sell for more than the cost of a furnished house in some parts of Istanbul. A single prized bulb might be traded for horses, land, or a small private bathhouse. Prices weren't standardized, they fluctuated wildly based on rumors, anticipation, and good old-fashioned hysteria. Sound familiar? Yep. It's eerily close to the Dutch tulip mania, but the Ottomans added their own signature flair, secrecy, poetry, and occasionally bribing a gardener with satin slippers. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman tulip craze was as financially devastating as its Dutch counterpart. Ottoman sources were notoriously romantic in tone, bulbs weren't priced, they were described. So, was that 20 silk bloom really worth its weight in silk, or was it just part of the metaphor-laden market lingo? We may never know. But we do know that fortunes were made and unmade over what were, essentially, moist onions in fancy wrapping. You duck into a low-arched cellar, lit by candle sconces and smelling of cloves. Inside, bulb dealers. Some legit, others, less so. They sit behind low tables covered in velvet cloths, displaying bulbs like gems. One even has his arranged in little glass domes, each labeled with names you've never heard: Flesh Flicker, The Yellow Lie, Unlistened Prayer. The names alone make your wallet twitch. A young assistant eyes you and offers a sample, just to smell. You lean in, curious, but it's a bulb, not a bloom. It smells like garlic with a hint of dirt and prestige. A weird combination. You politely decline. She shrugs and goes back to sorting bulbs with gloved fingers, like she's defusing explosives. And here's your fringe tidbit for the night: there was once a tulip smuggler known only as the Bell. His method? Hiding bulbs inside hollowed-out pastries sold to palace guards. Legend says he moved over 100 rare specimens this way before retiring to grow hyacinths in peace. You can still find murals of him tucked into alley walls, always depicted mid-bite, a sly grin, tulip leaves peeking from his kebab. You walk deeper into the cellar maze, where things get darker and riskier. One room is guarded by two large cats, not people, cats. They sit atop a stack of ledgers and blink at you like furry bouncers. Inside, it's quieter, more ceremonial. No coins clink. Just soft music, a ney flute, of course, and hushed voices bartering not in currency but in trade. One man offers a bottle of antique rosewater for a single bulb. Another proposes a love poem, handwritten on lambskin, sealed with real saffron dust. You realize, in this part of town, money is gauche. Rarity demands romance. You perch on a cushion by a stall where an older woman is polishing her bulbs with beeswax. Keeps the dreams in, she says. You nod, pretending that makes total sense. She slides you a bulb with a wink. This one weeps blue, she whispers, but only if you sing to it first. Sure. The world of bulbs was a different kind of madness from the display gardens. Up there, tulips were about showmanship and status. Down here, they were currency, power, secrets. Bulbs were hoarded, swapped, stolen, even cursed. That's right, cursed. Superstition ran wild, especially among desperate collectors. One tale tells of a bulb that killed every gardener who touched it, 4 in total, until someone finally planted it in a graveyard, where it bloomed black. Or maybe it was just a dark purple and someone got overexcited. You head back up the winding stairs now, cradling a small packet the old woman pressed into your palm. She insisted. Inside, just a pebble and a note that says, "Don't plant this until you've forgotten why you wanted it." Yeah. This is definitely the poetic part of town. At street level, dawn is a rumor. The horizon glows faintly, and a breeze stirs the awnings of shuttered shops. You look back once more at the market gate, where tulips once passed hands like state secrets. These weren't just flowers, they were bets on beauty, on status, on eternity wrapped in petals. And maybe, also, on loss. One of the oddest things about tulip bulbs is how long they take to grow. You could trade for one, obsess over it for months, and then, nothing. A dud. Or worse, a bloom that's almost what you dreamed. Close enough to hurt. That's the risk, isn't it? Investing your hopes in something that spends most of its life underground. But sometimes, against odds and logic, a bulb blooms into something that makes everyone stop. Not just look, but feel. Briefly. Fiercely. And then it wilts. The sun creeps higher now. The bulb sellers will rest soon, their candles snuffed, their ledgers tucked away. But tonight's glimpse into their world will linger, like scent in a petal's crease, or secrets folded inside a flower's heart. You drift east with the slow-turning wind, back toward the neighborhoods where the polished world of the elite collided with the more chaotic, more human layers of Ottoman life. It's quieter here, not because there's less to say, but because the walls seem to hold their breath. Brick archways lean over alleys like old friends listening in. You catch fragments of the past hanging between shuttered windows, music, maybe. Laughter. A parrot screaming obscenities. Hard to say. This part of the city belonged to the artisans, the people who didn't just admire tulips, they made tulips. Not the plants themselves, but their countless interpretations in porcelain, embroidery, silverwork, and ink. And for a brief, shimmering moment in Ottoman history, these humble craftsmen found themselves unexpectedly elevated. After all, when the empire obsesses over tulips, those who can paint them suddenly hold power. Here's your mainstream historical fact. During the tulip era, the Ottoman Imperial Workshop saw a surge in commissions for tulip-themed art, especially from the Nakashain, the imperial atelier responsible for miniature painting and ornamentation. Tulip motifs flooded textiles, tiles, coffee cups, even official state documents. Some edicts featured tiny tulips dancing along the margins, as if beauty could soften bureaucracy. Which, honestly, we could still try today. You pass a small wooden house with latticed windows and duck inside. It's the studio of a master tilemaker, long since gone, but the scent of fired clay clings stubbornly to the air. The walls are covered in fragments, broken panels of his nicked tiles, each bearing part of a tulip's curve, or the suggestion of one. You run your fingers over the glazed surface. Cool. Slightly cracked. Some flowers are stylized, all angles and elegance. Others are oddly emotional, as if painted by someone who'd recently been dumped by a very beautiful person. Artisans during this time were often anonymous. Their work signed not with names but with symbols, a fish, a crescent, a hand holding a brush. One fringe tidbit, a particular embroidery artist known only as the Needle allegedly worked tulips into the linings of royal robes, hidden where only the wearer could feel them brush against the skin. Intimate, secret beauty. That's the kind that lingers. You meander into a sunken courtyard filled with looms and silken threads drying like strings of candy. A cat sleeps on a stack of fabric dyed the exact color of a dying tulip's edge, faded pink with a gold shadow. Artisans used natural pigments, of course, crushed beetles, oxidized copper, madder root. No shortcuts. Every hue was fought for, coaxed from something that didn't want to give it up. Like memory. Historians still argue whether the tulip's popularity in the decorative arts reflected an organic shift in cultural taste or was pushed by courtly mandate. Did the people truly adore the flower, or did they just adapt because the Sultan's tailors started stitching tulips on every official but pillow? We'll never know. But the artisans didn't seem to mind. The tulip gave them focus. A muse with 6 petals and a complicated relationship to sunlight. Down another alley, you reach the bookbinder's row. Tiny shops where leather is tooled, pages are pressed, and covers are inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Many books from this era, especially poetry, were bound with tulips on the cover. Not just drawn, but sculpted, carved, embedded. Some had tulips whose colors changed slightly in the heat of one's hand. Yes, really. Early thermochromic pigment, Ottoman style. You pause before one open window. Inside, a calligrapher dips his reed pen and begins a flourish. His paper is pale blue, and the ink smells like rosewater and vinegar. As you watch, he draws not letters, but petals. And then a stem. And finally, in one smooth flick, the silhouette of a single tulip that seems to bow. Not forward, like it's showing off, but sideways, like it's listening. And here's the thing, tulips in Ottoman art almost never face the viewer directly. They look down or to the side. Shy, maybe. Or just polite. There's a theory, mostly whispered among museum interns and the kinds of professors who wear scarves in summer, that this reflects a cultural aesthetic. Beauty should never be too proud. A tulip that knows it's beautiful is already on the path to tragedy. You leave the calligrapher to his work and wander into a tea house frequented by artists. It's empty now, but the walls are covered in charcoal sketches of tulips that never existed, tulips with dragon tails, tulips with wings, tulips blooming from swords or teacups or crescent moons. This was a place where imagination ran wild. Where artisans whispered, over too much bitter tea, about finding the pure tulip. The one line, the one curve, the one hue that would capture the flower's essence. Some spent their whole lives trying. Most failed beautifully. One faded drawing catches your eye. It shows a tulip with no petals, just the suggestion of them, drawn with negative space. The entire thing is formed from what isn't there. Bold. Slightly sad. Definitely genius. The artist signed it with a simple phrase, "What remains?" The power of the tulip, for these people, wasn't just its color or shape. It was what it made possible. Commissions. Prestige. Entry into the palace sphere. For once, the empire was listening to its makers, not just its takers. But of course, it didn't last. As tulip culture became more standardized, certain shapes and colors prized above others, artisans were squeezed. Only specific styles were accepted by the court. Others were deemed unsuitable or provincial. Creativity dimmed under the weight of imperial taste. The tulip, once a doorway, slowly became a measuring stick. You step back out into the rising sun. The streets are warming. A baker yawns, unlocking his shutters. You catch a glimpse of tulips printed on the bread paper lining his baskets. Even now, even as the craze cooled, the image lingered. Like a scar. Or a story. The artists of the tulip era were both blessed and cursed. Their muse was in fashion, but for just long enough to trap them in it. Still, their fingerprints remain. In the corners of mosques. On forgotten vases. In the silent arc of a line. And sometimes, in the curve of a tulip that looks just a little bit like it's listening to your dreams. You wander deeper into the waking city now, where the air is thickening with the scent of yeast and soot and something sweet, maybe mulberries. The call to prayer echoes softly from a distant minaret, threading through the alleys like silk. But your steps take you toward a different kind of call, the quiet clink of brushes in water, the rustle of parchment, and the low hum of poetry being rehearsed under someone's breath. You're entering the salons and poetry circles, the beating heart of the tulip's emotional empire. See, the tulip era wasn't just about gardens or greed, it was about words. Beautiful, maddening, excessive words. Poetry became the soft engine of status and style, especially when laced with metaphors so layered you might need a nap just trying to unpack one. Tulips weren't just compared to love, they became love. They symbolized longing, pride, beauty, melancholy, even silence. And yes, silence has a flower. Your mainstream historical fact? During the early 1700s, under Sultan Ahmed III, poetry surged in popularity among the Ottoman elite. Not only were court poets commissioned to write florid verses in praise of tulips, but even bureaucrats and military officers dabbled in verse. It was fashionable to be fluent not only in Persian or Arabic but in the language of flowers. Tulips were no longer just plants, they were punctuation in a delicate social game. Say it wrong, and you weren't invited back to the pavilion. You step into a salon now, one of those long, low spaces lined with cushions, where slippers are left at the door and guests drink sherbet so sweet it practically hisses. A man with a velvet robe recites a ghazal so slowly that you nearly forget where his sentence began. The tulip appears in line 3, of course it does, wrapped in a metaphor about forbidden glances and moonlit skin. Someone sighs deeply. It might be you. And then there's a shift. A woman stands, her veil delicate but her voice sharper than the tip of a reed pen. She responds with her own verse, her tulip now a symbol of defiance. It blooms despite the shade, she says. The room pauses. Not for debate, but to admire her angle. In these circles, poetry wasn't about winning. It was about blooming better. A fringe tidbit for you, one Ottoman poet, Seyyid Veybi, wrote an entire poem cycle comparing each stage of a tulip's growth to the rise and fall of an empire. Budding was the ambition of youth. Full bloom was peak authority. And wilting? Well, that was bureaucracy. The final lines mention petals drowned in ink. Symbolic, sure, but also a little too on the nose. You sip something sweet and spicy, maybe cinnamon and pomegranate, and watch as another poet scribbles notes on his sleeve cuff. Not paper. Not parchment. Sleeve cuff. Why? Because true verses couldn't wait. Even if the ink bled into the linen, the thought was preserved. It's whispered that Sultan Ahmed himself once composed verses in the margins of royal decrees. That footnote about tax collection? Actually a haiku about a particularly moody tulip. Historians still argue whether this explosion of floral poetry was a genuine cultural blossoming or a deliberate distraction. Was the state using verse as a pressure valve, keeping the elite entertained while deeper unrest simmered in the provinces? Or did the tulip's bloom genuinely open a space for softer, more introspective masculinity in a usually rigid court? Either way, the result was pages, volumes, of verse. Libraries bloated with silk-bound notebooks. Some poems were devotional. Others downright flirty. A few were so dense with metaphor they became unsolvable puzzles, tulips that pointed to love, that pointed to God, that pointed to death, that somehow circled back to breakfast pastries. Don't overthink it. You step into another room, smaller, quieter. This one is dim, lit only by an oil lamp and a skylight half covered in leaves. Two people sit cross-legged on the floor, editing a poem together. Not reciting, editing. This was the hidden world behind the performance, lovers of language dissecting the placement of a comma like it might explode. They argue, gently, about whether a tulip should be drooping or bowed. The first suggests sadness. The second, reverence. Maybe, one of them whispers, it's both. It hits you, in the Ottoman tulip world, everything had at least two meanings. Maybe that's why it flourished so vividly in poetry. The flower itself became a kind of literary tool. Want to express unrequited love? Tulip. Political danger? Tulip. The awkward ache of watching someone else wear the outfit you picked out but better? Also tulip. It's the Swiss Army knife of metaphors. You remember something you saw painted on a tile earlier, a tulip, yes, but inside it, calligraphy. A line from Rumi, with life as short as a half-taken breath, don't plant anything but love. It wasn't just decor. It was doctrine. You pass through a final salon, this one bordering on chaotic. The walls are filled with unfinished poems, painted over older ones, and the air is heavy with jasmine and judgment. Here, it's less polite. This is the space where poets test risky metaphors, get rejected, come back sharper. Someone reads a line comparing the tulip to a fallen vizier. Gutsy. You wait for silence. Instead, applause. The room's full of risk-takers. And yet, even in this edge space of verse, the tulip dominates. It haunts every stanza, every simile. It's the star, the muse, the phantom. One poet stands and recites a single line, in the mirror of your eye, a tulip wavers. That's it. He sits. Everyone nods, as if he's just summarized heartbreak, longing, and dinner reservations all at once. Outside now, the street has changed. You notice that someone's drawn a tulip in chalk on the cobblestones. Just one line, elegant and uneven. It'll fade by evening. But maybe that's the point. The poetic life of the tulip wasn't about permanence. It was about the echo. The trace. The soft press of a symbol that stays long after the petals fall. You exhale. And somewhere, in the next alley, another metaphor opens its petals. The morning presses onward, sunlight now bouncing off copper rooftops and sending little flickers across the cobbled streets. Your feet shuffle forward, softer now, as if the dust itself remembers too much. You pass a baker slapping dough with practiced palms and catch a whiff of sesame and ash. Someone whistles a song about spring. You almost forget that beneath all this cozy bustle, the empire's gears are grinding. Because by now, the tulip isn't just a flower. It's a symbol, a transaction, an argument dressed as a compliment. It's also an economic disaster in disguise. Yes, you've arrived at the part where things start to wobble, when tulip fever shifts from whimsy to wallet. And spoiler, it's not going to be pretty. Your mainstream historical fact? During the late tulip era, the Ottoman upper class began inflating the price of rare tulip bulbs to absurd levels. Some fetched prices equivalent to years of a laborer's wage. This wasn't just about showing off a rare flower at a garden party, it was about using that flower as proof of one's taste, wealth, and political relevance. Sound familiar? It should. Picture tulip NFTs, but 300 years earlier and with slightly more silk robes. You step into a merchant's courtyard now. Elegant, measured. There are ledgers stacked high, smelling like damp parchment and rosewater. You peek inside one and see what appears to be an entire column dedicated to tulip-related expenses: bulbs, pots, fertilizers, grafting knives, hired specialists to whisper to them in Persian. Okay, maybe not the last one. But only maybe. There were auctions, sometimes secret, sometimes scandalous. Men in finely embroidered caftans would crowd into candlelit rooms and bid on bulbs with names like Azure Grief or Moondrunk Flame. No one actually saw the bloom yet. They were buying an idea, a dream compressed into papery brown skins. Like paying for a symphony you haven't heard based on how the sheet music smells. Here's your fringe tidbit. One record tells of a bulb purchased for a price that included 3 horses, a silver samovar, and a promise of marriage to someone's cousin. The cousin reportedly had no say in the matter, but did receive a matching tulip tattoo afterward. Love and commerce, Ottoman style. You sit beside an old stone fountain where vendors once gathered to whisper rates and rumors. Word of mouth drove prices higher. A neighbor saw a bloom with 9 tips instead of 6. A friend claimed his flower only opened during the call to prayer. Hype, mystique, marketing. You could almost hear the petals rustling in anticipation of their own myth. But here's where it tips. One season, the bulbs don't bloom. Or they do, but with less sparkle. Maybe the weather shifts, maybe pests arrive, or maybe the Sultan compliments the wrong tulip in public. Prices waver. A merchant hesitates. Then another. Suddenly, the market panics. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman tulip bubble was a true crash, like the famous Dutch tulip mania, or more of a slow deflation, managed by courtly silence and clever debt reshuffling. Either way, people started losing money. Serious money. And serious money equals serious whispers. The government tried to intervene. Decrees were issued, urging moderation. The Sultan, previously a tulip stan, now pretended he barely liked flowers. Who, me? I'm more of a pomegranate guy. The imperial court stopped flaunting its gardens quite so loudly. Gardeners began to quietly dig up bulbs, shuffle them into more common beds, as if hoping the earth would forget what they'd cost. You pass a garden gate now swinging open in the breeze. Once, it would have been guarded, counted, watched. Now it yawns like an old mouth missing teeth. Inside, rows of tulips still bloom, but no one tends them. They rise like survivors, unkempt, glorious, unbothered by the economics that once defined them. Some of the finest bulbs were simply abandoned. Others were stolen, traded in secret, or smuggled across borders in satchels lined with coffee beans. There's a story of a bulb sewn into the hem of a diplomat's robe. When it finally bloomed in a new land, it turned out to be disappointingly average. Just a tulip, after all. And yet, for that brief stretch of time, it had been priceless. You move into the part of the city where craftsmen now grumble quietly over tea. The commissions have dried up. No more gold-leaf tulips to illuminate manuscripts. No more silver vases shaped like their petals. One weaver picks up a nearly finished silk pattern and sighs. Feels like sewing a ghost, he mutters. The shift in fashion was swift, brutal. Tulips became passé, almost shameful. Like last year's party trick that now makes everyone a little embarrassed. Artists began favoring geometric patterns again. Poetry drifted back toward mystical themes. The tulip lingered, sure, but as a shadow of itself. Decorative, but no longer dominant. And in that shift, you feel the city exhale. Not relief, more like resignation. The empire had tried to bottle beauty. And beauty, famously, refuses to sit still. You pause before a shuttered pavilion that once hosted lavish tulip nights. The silks are gone. The lanterns, rusted. There's just one clay pot left out front, and in it, believe it or not, a single, stubborn bloom. Not rare. Not expensive. Just there. Defiant in its simplicity. You get the sense it grew from a forgotten bulb, trampled and tossed aside. But it grew anyway. Which brings us to the question no one wanted to ask during the craze: what is beauty worth? Can it be priced? Preserved? Passed down like land or titles? The Ottoman elite tried. And like everyone before or since, they found themselves chasing an echo, confusing admiration with ownership. Still, even in the wreckage, something lingered. A whisper in the archives. A pressed petal in a forgotten book. A memory of a night when someone held a candle too close to a tulip and swore the flame danced back. The tulip didn't die. It just stopped trying to be a celebrity. And maybe, finally, it could breathe again. The air has grown heavy now, not with heat, but with the weight of memory. You step past the remnants of manicured gardens that have quietly gone feral. Tulip beds once hemmed in by marble now sprawl across cracked walkways. It's the same city, but gentler. Calmer. Like it finally stopped holding its breath. You hear laughter in the distance, small, loose, human. Not the stylized chuckle of nobles sipping sherbet, but kids chasing each other with sticks, inventing worlds out of dust and broken tiles. You pass by a wall where a tulip has been painted in simple brushstrokes, rough, almost childish. Not for show, not for status. Just because someone thought the shape was beautiful. We're walking now through what comes after the tulip craze, when the obsession has ebbed, but the petals still cling to the edges of the empire's story. You start to see how the tulip era, despite all its silk and spectacle, left behind quieter echoes, in craft, in civic projects, even in the way Istanbul rearranged itself. The bloom had faded, but its roots went deeper than anyone expected. Your mainstream historical fact? Even after the tulip era officially ended around 1730, the aesthetic values it nurtured persisted. Ottoman architecture grew lighter, more ornate. Parks and fountains multiplied. The city, scarred as it was, kept a touch of its floral dream. Historians call this cultural inertia, where even after a political or economic system collapses, its artistic residue lingers like perfume on old velvet. You stroll through one of these inertia gardens, now, laid out not by sultans but by city officials decades later, who quietly maintained the flower beds because, frankly, the people liked them. Children learned to name tulips by color. Grandmothers saved seeds wrapped in old recipes. And occasionally, someone would insist their backyard bloom had descended from a legendary bulb once kissed by a vizier's sigh. Maybe. Maybe not. But the story kept the flower warm. Fringe tidbit time, a 19th century Ottoman census of city flora, Not exactly the riveting stuff of rebellion, contains a marginal note about a tulip of unknown parentage found blooming beside a drainpipe. The scribe called it persistent, uninvited, and beautiful. Basically a flowery version of that one friend who crashes on your couch and then redecorates your living room. And yet, it's in this persistence that the tulip actually starts to matter more. Without auctions. Without politics. It slips into everyday life like a rumor that refuses to die. Someone embroidering a pillow adds 3 tulips. A woodworker carves one into a mosque doorframe. A tilemaker, steady, meticulous, slips a bloom between geometric patterns, a wink to a past nobody wants to say out loud but nobody quite forgets. You find yourself in a narrow street where artisans still work, less pomp now, more practicality. One silversmith you pass is etching a compact mirror. Just before he finishes, he scratches in the tiniest tulip. Almost imperceptible. You ask why. He shrugs. It's for balance, he says. Too many straight lines otherwise. Historians still argue whether this quiet, lingering tulip aesthetic was intentional preservation or just emotional habit. Were people subtly honoring a lost golden age? Or was the tulip simply too nice looking to give up entirely? Did the symbolism fade, or just get softer? What's certain is this: the tulip stopped being a currency and became a comfort. A nod. A little floral punctuation mark in the empire's long and complicated sentence. You sit near a public fountain now. It's one of those post-tulip era additions, a civic gift, made not for elites but for everyday hands. The water trickles slowly, predictably, the way peace sometimes feels. The stonework includes a faded tulip motif, and you realize it's not there to impress. It's there because it belonged. All around you, signs of the empire adjusting its posture. Less fanfare. More function. A school opens where a garden once sprawled. A mosque hosts poetry nights, still florid, but now shared over lentils and laughter. Even the palaces feel quieter, as if the stone walls learned something about breath. You peek into a tailor's workshop. Along the windowsill, tulips, yes, but also onions, mint, and some lopsided marigolds. The flowers no longer demand reverence. They share space with the practical, the edible, the plainly lovely. There's a strange peace in all this. The frenzy is over. The auction's gone. But the tulip? Still here. Not as a symbol of ego or empire. Just a flower. Which is kind of the point, isn't it? You make your way toward the Bosphorus, the waterline where Istanbul exhales into sea. The breeze here is saltier, wider. You watch as a boatman paints a new coat of color onto his little ferry. Red, green, then a small tulip shape near the stern. He sees you noticing and grins. Brings good luck, he says. My grandmother told me. Or maybe I just like it. You nod, but say nothing. You're starting to see how this once mighty flower now thrives in footnotes, in passing gestures, in grandma's stories told over fig jam. Less opulent. More real. And somehow, that feels like victory. You linger by the shoreline a little longer, watching gulls arc against a sky that's beginning to shade from blue to apricot. The air smells like salt and worn wood, and your thoughts drift, not to sultans or rebels, but to the strange way history leaves behind the most unexpected souvenirs. The way something as delicate as a tulip petal can outlast revolts, budgets, and even fashion. Your feet carry you uphill again, winding through older quarters of the city now, where the plaster peels off buildings like flaking pastry, and cats rule the sidewalks with the confidence of retired diplomats. Here, the past doesn't announce itself, it mutters from behind latticed windows and murmurs from the corners of quiet courtyards. This is where we start encountering the ghosts of tulip culture, stitched into stories and habits long after the craze cooled. Because even when the empire pretended to forget, the people didn't. They carried the flower forward, not in ledgers or law, but in lullabies, tablecloths, and inked daydreams. Here's your mainstream historical fact: the decorative arts of the post-tulip era remained rich with floral motifs, especially tulips. From Iznik ceramics to courtly miniatures, the flower became shorthand for grace, elegance, and fleeting joy. It was no longer a status symbol. It was a feeling. You brush your fingers along a tile-framed doorway, where a single tulip tilts its head slightly left, as if listening. The house is ordinary. That tile? Hand-fired in a workshop founded a century after the tulip era officially ended. The kiln might be gone now, but its colors linger like a tune hummed by someone folding laundry. Fringe tidbit? In one 18th-century folktale collected from Anatolian villagers, a tulip appears not as a flower but as a talking character, a sassy plant who gives bad relationship advice to a shepherd. The tale ends with her being planted in a pot to think about her behavior. Comedy, botany, and subtle satire, Ottoman bedtime stories weren't playing around. As you turn a corner, you find yourself in front of a school built in the early 1800s. A weathered stone arch curves overhead, and right in the center? A tulip. Stylized, abstract, nearly geometric. And yet, unmistakable. You stop. You imagine the stonemason, chipping away under the sun, humming to himself. Maybe he never saw the palace gardens. Maybe he didn't care about price wars or poetic metaphors. But something in the shape meant something to him. Stillness. Softness. Maybe his mother used to grow them in a pot on their roof. Historians still argue whether the tulip's post-era presence was part of a deliberate national identity effort or simply the residue of beauty too stubborn to erase. Was it designed by nostalgia, or just designed by habit? Either way, the tulip lingered. You reach a tea house now, the kind that feels held together by steam and memory. Inside, the furniture doesn't match. The windows fog easily. A man with a thick mustache pours strong, glassy tea into tulip-shaped glasses, those iconic, waist-cinched silhouettes that everyone associates with Turkish hospitality. That's right. Even the glassware inherited the tulip's legacy. You cradle one in your hands, warm and delicate. It's not just functional, it's symbolic. The shape concentrates aroma. It cools faster at the top. And it's beautiful. Not extravagant, not precious, just beautiful in a way that feels lived in. And that's the trick, isn't it? The tulip shifted from sacred to social. From rarefied to reachable. From idol to companion. Someone in the tea house pulls out a notebook. Doodles a tulip in the margin. You lean over and see it's been stylized, almost like a heart turned upside down. No signature. No flourish. Just a quick bloom made in ink, possibly without thinking. But there it is, again. You move toward a cemetery at the edge of the district. Quiet. Ivy draped. And you see tulips carved into headstones, not all, but many. Nestled between names, dates, and prayers. Some are crisp, others worn down to gentle humps. The flower, once celebrated with fireworks and feasts, now rests beside lives both grand and humble. You pause in front of one such stone. The name worn smooth, the tulip still visible. It's oddly comforting. The flower no longer screams for attention. It just listens. Stands vigil. You remember how the empire once tried to brand itself through this bloom, to fix beauty into something static and saleable. But nature never agreed to that deal. Flowers bloom, fade, and come back without needing an invitation. The late Ottoman period even saw waves of reform and modernization, changes far more consequential than the rise and fall of tulip prices. But the flower remained. Tucked into fabric, whispered in poetry, passed down in wedding gifts and kitchen tiles. It's almost like the empire taught itself a strange kind of humility through petals. An accidental lesson. That beauty isn't always meant to be controlled. That some things are better appreciated than owned. The tea settles in your chest, warm and grounding. You walk again, this time slower, not out of fatigue but reverence. Every shadow feels richer now. Every corner, a petal in disguise. A street performer strums a stringed instrument nearby, singing about lost love. The chorus? A woman with tulips in her hair. You want to ask if he knows about the tulip era. But somehow, you think the answer wouldn't matter. The flower's meaning has moved on. You step over a cracked tile, yet another tulip, and realize the entire city might as well be wrapped in petals. Not the showy kind. The kind that fall, quietly, and then sink into the soil to bloom again next year. No auction needed. By now, your steps feel less like walking and more like floating. The city around you is quieter, not because it's empty, but because you've started listening differently. You've traded the high drama of palaces for the soft persistence of flower pots. You begin to see the tulip not as a spectacle, but as a companion to the everyday. You drift into a neighborhood where laundry lines zigzag above alleyways and the smell of grilled eggplant winds through the air. Someone's playing a radio, crackling slightly, where a singer croons about red tulips in the window. And even though the language feels older, the sentiment clicks immediately. The flower still signals longing. Or maybe home. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the late 19th and early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire had become a shadow of its once mighty self, nicknamed the sick man of Europe. Yet even in this decline, tulips remained oddly central in national art, school textbooks, and even some early Turkish nationalist symbols. It's like the empire, uncertain of what it had become, looked backward and found a flower still willing to bloom. You pause at a municipal building, built in the 1910s, during a time when bureaucrats were trying very hard to seem very serious. But even here, in the molding near the roof, you spot tulip shapes. Slightly angular. Geometrically disciplined. But tulips, nonetheless. It's like they snuck in when no one was looking. Or maybe the architect just had a soft spot. You smile at the thought. Time for your quirky fringe tidbit. There's a theory, part fan gossip, part actual research, that one of the earliest Turkish propaganda posters, promoting unity before World War I, contained a stylized tulip in the background. Just one. Barely visible. And whether it was intentional or some artist's flourish, people noticed. A few years later, more tulips began to sneak into posters, postage stamps, and even coinage. The tulip had shapeshifted once again. No longer a luxury item or even a nostalgic echo, it became a kind of emotional shorthand. Something stable in a collapsing world. A symbol without the snobbery. A motif that could stretch across centuries without being tacky. The historical equivalent of your favorite hoodie. Historians still argue whether this was a deliberate return to cultural roots or simply convenient symbolism. After all, you don't have to license a tulip. It doesn't shout like a lion or sting like a snake. It just fits. You find yourself by a bookstall next. Sun-faded titles spill from the tables. The vendor waves lazily, more interested in his tea than his wares. You thumb through a poetry anthology and, no surprise, there's a poem titled "To the Tulip." It's not from the 1700s. It's from 1941. Wartime. Uncertain. And yet the tulip survives as a metaphor for persistence, and maybe, stubborn hope. You sit on the curb, the book in your lap. That's when you notice the tiles underfoot. Mismatched, chipped, old. But two of them, tucked between plainer ones, carry floral designs. Faded tulips. Planted, probably, when this street was first paved. You wonder how many shoes stepped on them without noticing. How many couples walked here? How many kids dropped ice cream cones and made up stories about the flowers whispering secrets to the cracks? You get up and stroll through a neighborhood garden, nothing fancy. Just a collection of green patches tended by residents who probably argue over tomato cages and where to put the compost. But there, between the beans and sunflowers, a lone tulip, blooming late. Maybe it was planted on purpose. Maybe it wandered in. Either way, it holds its head high, even as summer edges closer. You lean against a gate, thinking about how something that began as a diplomatic gift, then transformed into a status symbol, and later collapsed under the weight of its own hype, somehow made it all the way to now. Not triumphant. But unbothered. A young girl runs past you. Stops. Points at the tulip. Pretty, she says. Then runs on. Doesn't need a footnote. Doesn't need to know about sultans or revolts. Just, pretty. That's the final transformation, isn't it? The tulip has let go of its historical baggage. No longer a royal hostage. No longer a commodity. It's just part of the landscape. Not screaming for attention. Just, present. And in that way, the tulip wins. It outlasts titles, economies, rebellions, even fashion trends. It goes underground when things get rough, then re-emerges in spring, quietly defiant. You pass by a wedding procession, modern, loud, joyful. The bride wears a simple veil. But the flower in her hair? Yep, a tulip. Probably plastic. Maybe silk. But they're all the same. You imagine her grandmother wore one too. Maybe even her great-grandmother. Generational beauty, passed down like a recipe with no measurements. Even if the Ottoman Empire is long gone, its petals remain. Not in museums. But in moments like this. A baby's blanket patterned with tulips. A bakery's logo shaped like one. A street artist who tags walls with a bright red bloom. Not because of history. But because the shape just feels right. You realize now that the tulip isn't really about the past anymore. It's about continuity. Repetition. A loop of beauty that refuses to shut up, even after everyone else has gone quiet. You watch as the sun dips lower, lighting the tiled domes in soft amber. In that glow, the city stops feeling ancient and instead becomes eternal. Like it's paused mid-breath. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of your vision, another tulip opens. And it doesn't care who's watching. You walk on, slower now, not out of tiredness but because there's nowhere in particular you need to go. The city is humming at a lower frequency, and you're tuned into it. What began as a stroll through history has turned into something softer, like reading the last few pages of a book you don't want to end. A light breeze brushes against your cheek, carrying with it the scent of baking bread and faint tobacco smoke. The streetlights flicker on one by one, their golden glow stretching long shadows across ancient cobblestones. You pass a shuttered flower shop, its window fogged from the inside. A single tulip sits in a vase behind the glass, faux, probably, but still beautiful in its upright patience. Waiting. Unbothered. Here's your mainstream historical fact. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the founding of modern Turkey in 1923, tulips weren't erased from memory. In fact, the early republic eventually embraced them, particularly in Istanbul, where tulips were reintroduced into public parks in the mid-20th century. And since 2005, the Istanbul Tulip Festival has rebloomed each spring, with millions of bulbs planted across the city. So yes, what was once the indulgent obsession of sultans has now become part of family picnics and Instagram backdrops. A sea of color beneath modern skyscrapers, where kids play tag among flower beds, not knowing, or caring, that they're stepping through centuries of layered meaning. And here's your fringe tidbit, tucked in like a tulip bulb in a coat pocket. Some tulip bulbs planted in Istanbul's Emirgan Park today are direct descendants of bulbs first bred during the original tulip era. A fragile biological whisper echoing across time. They've outlived revolts, invasions, empire collapses, and even sprinkler system upgrades. You sit on a bench overlooking a small hill dotted with those same tulips. The night has fully arrived now, blanketing the city in velvet blue. Street sounds grow distant. A nearby fountain burbles like someone sleep-talking. You think of all the people who once sat just like this, centuries ago, palace scribes, weary traders, poets trying to impress girls with flower metaphors. Different lives, same bloom. You picture the sultans who once obsessed over these petals. How they counted them, ranked them, named them like racehorses. How they tried to freeze beauty in place. How that always fails. And how, somehow, it doesn't matter. Historians still argue whether the tulip was the beginning of the empire's cultural awakening or the start of its aesthetic decline. Whether it marked progress or distraction. Whether beauty can be revolutionary or just expensive wallpaper. But you're not here to judge. You're here to listen. The city breathes around you. A cat curls beneath your bench, tail flicking lazily. Somewhere, a night market packs up, and a call to prayer rises, not loud, just there. Like the tulip. You lean back. Eyes half closed. The stone under you is cool. The breeze tastes faintly metallic. You're tired, but not heavily. Just the kind of tired that welcomes softness. Like bedding down under an old quilt stitched with stories no one quite remembers but everyone somehow knows. You smile at the thought of the tulip's final form, not in books, not in gardens, but in a single quiet moment like this. A flower that outlasted its hype, its politics, its scandals. A flower that simply continued, one bulb at a time, one bloom at a time. And here you are. You've made it to the end. From elite court festivals to nighttime park benches, you've followed the tulip on its improbable journey, splashy, doomed, resurrected, reinterpreted. You watched it fall from grace and rise again, not as a status symbol but as a shared secret. That's the power of beauty, isn't it? It doesn't vanish. It shifts. Finds the next crack to bloom in. And now, it's time to let that image hold you. You, the quiet flower watcher. The bedtime historian. The person who now knows that even the most boring parts of history can bloom, if you pay close enough attention. Let the final image settle, a garden that stretches backward through time, each tulip nodding slightly in the breeze, petals loose but holding on. You step softly between the rows, the grass cold underfoot, the stars wide above. No footsteps behind you. Just flowers. Just quiet. So now, gently, we fold the story closed. You've wandered through corridors of gold, through tiled courtyards and crumbling alleyways, through poetry readings and failed rebellions. All led by the fragile persistence of a tulip. There's nothing more to follow. No more petals to chase. The garden gate creaks shut behind you, not with a clang, but with a hush, like the last page of a story slipping closed under soft lamplight. Your body feels heavier now, and that's okay. It's meant to. Every breath you take smooths the folds of time. Every blink grows slower. You can almost hear the petals drifting to the ground, each one falling more gently than the last. Let your shoulders sink. Let the warmth of the journey settle in your chest. There are no more sultans tonight. No budgets to balance, no festivals to stage, no revolts to put down. Just the rhythm of your breath, and the echo of footsteps through moonlit gardens. The world can wait. The flowers will still be here in the morning, their heads turned slightly toward the sun. Unhurried. Undemanding. Unbothered. You are, in this moment, part of their story. Part of the quiet legacy they left behind. And just like them, you've earned your rest. So close your eyes. Let the fan hum, soft as a lullaby. Let sleep pull you under like cool earth embracing a bulb. You're safe. You're still. You're blooming in your own way now. Good night.